Donald Trump has been on the national political scene for more than 10 years, but in a lot of ways, it seems as if America's top news organizations have yet to be able to figure out how to cover him properly. In 2015, when he first came on the scene, the national media were not prepared for a politician who would lie as easily as he breathed and who would viciously attack anyone who told the truth about him. And yet, a year into his second presidential term, many organizations have not been able to adjust to the new environment. Despite the many failures of America's news media with regard to Trump, however, it is also the case that in 2025, some journalists, like the Pentagon Press Corps, have shown courage and alacrity in dealing with the constant bullying and deception, including from corporate executives who are eager to show fealty to an administration that loves to deploy government power against the free press. There's a lot that happened with Trump in the media in 2025. And so in this episode, I wanted to unpack some of that with Margaret Sullivan. She's the executive director of the Columbia University Journalism School and also the former public editor of the New York Times and a former columnist with the Washington Post. Currently, she writes at The Guardian and at her newsletter, American Crisis. I hope you'll enjoy it. Theory of Change is part of the Flux Media Network, so go to flux.community for more podcasts and articles about politics, media, journalism, and technology, and how they all intersect to create our culture. And if you like what we're doing, we have both free and paid subscription options. You can subscribe on Substack at flux.community, and you can also subscribe on Patreon at patreon.com/discoverflux. Thanks a lot for your support, especially if you're a paid subscriber. I really appreciate it. And if you're watching on YouTube, please do click the like and subscribe button so you can get notified whenever there's a new episode. That is really helpful. And if you can leave a review somewhere, wherever you might be watching this, that would be great. Or feel free to share this episode or any other one that you like on social media. All right, let's get into the program. And joining me now is Margaret Sullivan.
Hey,
Margaret, welcome to
thank you.
Theory of Change.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, good to have you. So it's been the first year of the second Trump administration, and I thought it would be good to do kind of a retrospective of how things were in this first year in the media from your standpoint, and whether you see things changing for the better or for the worse. So there's a lot to talk
Sure.
about. So why don't we just start overall with how do you see what are the main differences in the way that Trump is being covered this first year versus the first
Right.
administration?
Well, I wish I could say that I saw a dramatic difference in the way um, he's being covered in this second time around, but I don't really think that's the case. My feeling is that the mainstream press never really learned how to cover him to begin with. And I don't really see a huge change in that. Um, you know, you have to deal with the fact that he has a lot of lies and misstatements in what he says, but they're so constant that I don't think that the mainstream press has sort of ever, there's fact checking, there's an effort to say, oh well, that wasn't true, but there's still there's still a lot of the same stuff that I think bedeviled the press and the public, frankly, in his first term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right in terms of the coverage. In terms of the owners, though,
Oh,
unfortunately, there has
that
been a
is different.
remarkable
Yeah,
change.
that is different. I mean, we're seeing in big media um, just this really very fast consolidation of ownership that is continuing to progress. So these media conglomerates are getting bigger, and they, and then the decisions. This is particularly true, but not only, but particularly true in the world of TV news. So ABC is owned by Disney. CBS is now owned and controlled by Paramount Global, and that too is probably going to grow and get bigger or different. CNN is in the mix because of because of their ownership. And, it kind of goes on and on like that. So, I think what happens is that the priorities are less coming from the journalists, not entirely, I don't want to overstate it, but certainly there have been decisions that have been made about settling lawsuits that Trump has begun that seem pretty clearly to be coming from corporate concerns rather than journalistic values.
Yeah, well, and definitely with ABC that was the case, and CBS as well. And yeah, I think what a lot of this has shown though is that really, what the media had in terms of standards and things like that, they were norms. There was no real mechanism by which the public could hold them accountable, or the staff could hold them accountable, or something. Organization, professional associations or whatever. These didn't exist, and that's, I think, is the kind of biggest thing about the 10 years that we've had of Trump on the scene, is that norms are nothing ultimately. They exist only in your mind.
They are enactments. They are not, actual real things to stop
No,
problems.
it's not as if there are, media cops out there who are going to say, let's consult the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics and issue tickets. And this, as you say, a lot of what's happened during both of these Trump administrations is that we found out that people were acting out of norms that had developed for a long time, and then the norms have been smashed. And oh, I guess, oh, that can happen, and there's no consequence for it. And maybe the norms weren't so great anyway, but in some cases they at least sort of, um, you know, there were some good things about them. So, but we find out that, in a way, this is again a little bit overstated or maybe a little falsely stated, but it's like we were all on the honor system, and now we find out that there's no consequences for doing things another way.
Yeah. Well, and there's an interesting paradox to that topic more generally, though, that when we look outside of the United States, some countries like the UK, for instance, have agencies, government agencies like Ofcom, and these agencies exist in many different nations that do have regulatory power on media. And I think a lot of times people have said, well, that would be nice if there was something that could administer accountability. But gosh, can you imagine what Donald Trump would have done with an Ofcom under his control?
I mean, I'm always very nervous about the idea of the government, whatever government, having, you know, direct regulatory or funding power over the press. So, you know, I mean, with the funding piece of it, I think about this in terms of the demise of local news, which has really, continued at a really fast downward pace. And people say, oh, well, certainly you wouldn't want to see direct funding of news organizations. And there was a long time in my many decade career where I said, definitely not. And now I'm like, well, I don't know. Would it mean the difference between keeping some local newspapers coming, operational or not? And maybe in some cases, if there could be some guardrails built in, maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing. But and people always, the public likes to remind me that there once was a thing called the Fairness Doctrine, which had some power over, kind of equal time kinds of issues for broadcast news, and that went away a long time ago. And people, I think it's more that they like the idea of it. I'm not sure they would really like the reality of it too much, but
Yeah, I think that's right. And when you look at Brendan Carr's FCC, it's obvious that this would be something that Trump and his cronies would 100% abuse in ways that would be appalling to even the most ardent Fairness
Yeah,
Doctrine
I think
boosters,
that's
I
right.
would say.
Yeah, that's true.
The other thing also is, and of course, I can say this as a former member of the liberal bias industry, is that, the Trump, administrations, especially in the second one here, this is the apotheosis of the liberal media bias complex. Since Reed Irvine and Richard Nixon in the 70s had spent, basically 50 years, completely undermining and attacking the national press and saying that it was hopelessly, permanently, irrevocably biased and must be delegitimized. Trump this is the fulfillment of that Nixon project, and in a way that I think a lot of people, that's not something that I think has been remarked upon enough. The way this
Right,
is
and
the
I think
through line from
another
Nixon.
thing that came out of that era was the birth of Fox News. Um, that, oh, we can't kind of Roger Ailes and Nixon, the idea that we can never let this happen again. We can never let a Republican president be drummed out of office again. This is the thinking on it. I'm not saying I subscribe to this, but so we need to have our own media. And then Fox is born in, I think, 1996, and you know we see what a profound impact it has had. And then, of course, everything that's kind of cropped up around that. But Fox itself is still powerful in its own way. Influential,
Yeah.
I guess I'll say.
Yeah, well, it still remains the biggest node in the right wing
Yes.
media
Right.
ecosystem
Right.
for
Right.
sure. Yeah, and I mean, and that that project that we're talking about here, it is. I mean, they literally did. Roger Ailes and other people wrote a memo for Nixon, to create Television News Incorporated, which launched as a proto CNN. Actually, that's actually where CNN came from. I'll link to. I think it was Gabriel Sherman that wrote
Yeah.
about that with regard to Roger Ailes and that, and that's it's a little bit of history that's, it like and it created satellite television in a large way for news, integrated into that way.
That was a time too when basically social media didn't exist. And so we really are living in a very, very different world now. The world of podcasters, she said, while on a podcast, and, you know, um, very powerful media figures who aren't traditional journalists, but rather, influential voices, whether we like them or not. They're very influential.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and one to that point, one of the other kind of dynamics of the first year of Trump, from the corporate standpoint, is that it does seem like, especially when we look over at Skydance and Paramount and the installation of Bari Weiss at CBS News, that there seems to be this thought that there's just this massive audience out there of of right-wing voters who want a staid broadcast news that it has more Republican talking points
Yeah.
in it. And I don't think that exists.
Right. I
don't
mean,
think
I
that
guess I would
exists.
tweak what you said a little bit. I think the thinking is um, that there's this huge demand for some sort of center right, but kind of mostly centrist, but also kind of right leaning, like the Scott Jennings, Scott Jennings, who, as your listeners probably know, is on CNN for the most part, and is a defender of Trump's, and has been recruited, as I understand it, by Bari Weiss at CBS, as he's sort of like, oh yeah, if we could only have more of that. Um, and I agree with you, Matthew, that I don't think there's a huge demand for that. CNN tried a version of that a year or two, I can't remember now, a couple years ago, where they tried to go very, very sort of center right, I think. And, it wasn't successful. In fact, it failed pretty badly. So, I mean, CNN always struggles. So who knows what can work there. But yeah, this sort of thinking that, yeah, that Bari Weiss is the answer because she's anti-woke and she won't be like the rest of these liberal media, people. And in fact, that is turning out to be the case. But whether it's a successful formula, I have my doubts, especially when you do things that alienate your newsroom pretty badly, like she's doing. We're recording this, the day after we find out that Bari quite unilaterally has held back an already reported, already vetted, already lawyered piece on 60 Minutes about the El Salvador prison that would make the Trump administration, attempts to hold them to account. And they tried very hard to get comment from different heads of agencies and departments and so on, and probably from the White House. And, this happens. You don't get comment. Well, you run the piece anyway, and you say they wouldn't comment. But what she's saying is, no, we're not going to run it because it's lacking that comment and it needs more reporting. Well, that reporting piece of it has already been done. And, when you have a staff like you have at 60 Minutes that's very experienced, they don't like that. And I think that, you don't really want to lose your newsroom, which I would imagine she's in the process of doing just that right now.
Yeah, well, and a lot of them have already quit, and I have to imagine that people are, the people who are still there are looking for the exit and trying to find a place to land. I have no doubt about that. Now, with regard to her, though, one of the other initiatives that she has put into place, which will be launching in 2026, is a debate series, which seems to be trying to recapitulate the debates that ABC News filed in the 1960s with, or I think it was, or was it the 70s? I forget, whatever that was, with William F. Buckley Jr. and Gore Vidal. I think that's what they're trying to do because, I mean, for ABC, they were and also ran at that time, they were a new network. And they used them to get more ratings. So I think that's what she's trying to do. But the problem is she doesn't know how to have debates. And she doesn't have relationships with people who can actually have a meaningful debate. So she's booked basically a bunch of Alan Colmes liberals or people who are conservatives like Steven Pinker to represent the left. And it's like, well, this is a Potemkin debate. And the topics that she wants people to debate are tired and boring. And one of them being, has feminism failed women? Well, the fact that a woman is allowed to be the editor-in-chief of CBS News and also one who is not straight, that would seem to be kind of an indicator that
and also one who's never been a journalist. How about that? Add that into the list of qualifications. And certainly, anyway, I mean, it doesn't seem like a super compelling topic to me, but, and also she had this vaunted town hall interview with Erica Kirk, which, from what I've read, the ratings were poor. Not that everything should be about ratings, but I don't think it sort of caught the public imagination in the way that might have been hoped.
Yeah, and I think the reason for that being that the people who like Erica Kirk do not like CBS News. They're not going to watch it. And then the people who are watching CBS News don't like Erica.
Right. And I think that's more, and I think that is actually a lot of what happened. A version of that happened at CNN during that period we were talking about, which is who's your audience here? And who do you think your audience is? Because I'm not sure there is one. So I mean, to
Yeah.
me, there is something appealing, of course, about trying to, get an audience and a readership or, people, citizens, if you will, who don't necessarily agree with you or may have very different takes on things. I mean, I think that's good. That's what American democracy is supposed to be about. But this version of it that's kind of, um, it's seeking an audience that is in somebody's fantasy world, and turns out not to really. It's what you said. The fans of Erica Kirk don't like CBS. The people who are traditional CBS watchers don't like Erica Kirk. So you're kind of um, missing the boat there, I think. And experimentation is fine and great. But I think you have to know a little bit about what you're trying to do. And so far, it doesn't seem like that's happening at CBS News.
Yeah. Well, and as somebody who was, in a past life coming from a more mainstream, moderate conservative viewpoint, which I've since changed from, I can appreciate what she's trying to do, although she doesn't want to admit that that's what she's trying to do. I think that that's part of the problem, is that she tells people that she's a liberal when basically there's no position that she has that's liberal other than that she supports, it seems to support abortion rights and seems to support lesbian and gay marriage. But those are positions that lots of Republicans have, in fact. And we can see that obviously with these abortion referenda, they pass everywhere they're allowed to be on the ballot, including
that's
Republican
become
states.
sort of mainstream thought, so it's not really liberal. Um, you know. So yeah, it's a weird. It's it's interesting to watch it play out. I don't think it's sort of disturbing, but it's and just to sort of see the as you mentioned, the CBS settling that lawsuit, that Trump filed over, 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris last fall before the election, which, was pretty standard editing from everything I know. And so, to sort of say, oh, this was edited to make her look good. And then for CBS to say, here's whatever they said, $16 million for your presidential library. I mean, I'm not 100% sure of those numbers, but, they settled it. What they didn't do was say, this was standard editing and we're going to defend ourselves. So then when that happens, and when ABC does what it did, which was also settle, um, it gets much harder for the next media organization to stand its ground.
It does. But we do have to give some credit to the New York Times and CNN for resisting Trump fake lawsuits against them in that regard.
Yeah, no,
you're right.
absolutely. And I would say even more, well, as much as that, the Associated Press, which, because the Associated Press has a global audience, it's not just people within the boundaries of the United States. When this thing came up about, oh, we're now going to call this body of water the Gulf of America, something that had been called the Gulf of Mexico for many, many, many years. And to people around the world, it is known as the Gulf of Mexico. The AP said, well, no, we're not going to change our style book because of what appeared to be a whim. And then Trump, punished them by keeping them off of Air Force One and keeping them out of briefings and stuff like that. And so the AP has sued, and it's still happening. They sued, they won one round, there was an appeal, they lost a round. So, but they have not just sort of said, oh, okay. And then I think the other thing, Matthew, that we saw was almost every news organization walking away when Pete Hegseth's Pentagon said, you basically, in essence, said, if you want a press pass, if you want credentials, to enter this building and come to briefings, you need to only publish what we say is okay. And really, hardly anyone would agree to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a definite bright spot for sure. But it does also contrast with the White House press corps, I think, in a bad way for the White House press
You mean
corps.
because it
The Trump
suggested some
administration.
solidarity, which we don't see from the White House press corps? Yeah,
Yeah.
you'll get a strongly worded letter, but but uh, but when the president points to a reporter and orders her to be quiet and calls her piggy, there's basically very little reaction in the moment. At least it's just kind of like, we're just here to do our job, and and some of that is about competition, some of that is about fear of losing access. So I would like to see that improve. And what I mean by improve is I'd like to see some collective action there. Even if it's, honestly, even if it's just the next person up saying, you know, uh, or several people saying, I'd like to repeat the question that, I can't remember her name at the moment, from Bloomberg News said,
Yeah.
because, to point it out and say, I don't think it's acceptable, because it's really not acceptable.
Yeah, and I think it's worth looking back to the Obama presidency, because there was solidarity against something that Obama did, that his White House was they were contemplating, or I think they did at one point, talk about banning Fox News from briefings because of its obvious partisanship. And that was pushed back even by CNN, and all the television
Right.
networks said, no, you can't do that. And look, I'm not a fan of Fox. They lie pretty much all the time. But they still are a part of this country, like it or not, and they have a right to be there as an organization that is professional and that does produce, news-shaped
Yes.
content.
Yeah, no, I think that was good to see during the Obama administration, and they backed off very fast, and
They did.
which obviously these are two very different administrations, but it does suggest that some kind of collective action and pressure might have an effect, but we don't know because we're not seeing that. So that's unfortunate.
It is. Well, and this is really a classic case of the tragedy of the commons in a lot of ways, because they're not used to an administration that so constantly and blatantly, viciously attacks their profession and their content and the things that they make. And so they just think, well, if I don't say anything, then it will go away, or that everything will blow over.
Some of this I really think is competition, and journalists have always been competitive. It's not it doesn't tend to be a kind of all that much sticking up for each other. It tends to be quite competitive, and as I said before, nobody wants to lose access. And meanwhile, your bosses are probably like, just stay in the room, and so we can put your question on the air later and show that we've got someone in the briefing room. I mean, that's the motivation more than sort of press rights writ large.
Yeah. Well, and it's an antiquated idea, I think, because the audience, they don't give a shit if you have somebody in the room there or not. They do not care. They just want to know, do you have news that is interesting to me and important? That's what they want to know. They don't care if you're in the room. They don't care if you get on camera with a question.
Right.
It doesn't matter to them. They don't even know who your journalists are, for that matter. So you're not accomplishing anything. But this is just this very antiquated mentality from, going back to the idea of when televised news briefings were novel. So it was a status point
to have your correspondent on camera and everybody knows, oh, so and so from XYZ asked this question. But those incentives do not exist anymore.
Certainly not as much. I mean, I do see, for example, you know, I mean, everybody likes to make fun of the evening news broadcasts that they don't matter anymore, but actually they have pretty big
Yeah.
viewership.
Still bigger than any
You know,
cable news show.
million.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's like if you look at them collectively, the three of them, the three, big ones, it's like I think it's something like 20 million people a night, or it was. And ABC will say now, and I don't know whether viewers care about this, but I do see it. Here's Mary Bruce. She's there, and we're going to hear. They don't say it just this way, but we're going to hear her question to the president right now. And I think there's some sort of pride of place there. Whether that is meaningful to the public, I don't know. But then again, ABC is the leader among those three, so maybe there's some effect.
Yeah, there's definitely a solidarity problem, and I guess one of the other stories of 2025 that kind of did illustrate that also, or that came out in 2025, was the absurd saga of the reporter Olivia Nuzzi, and her basically some sort of affair involvement with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And seemingly actively working to protect him from damaging news, or to get ahead of it, and giving him strategic advice. I mean, we haven't seen anything like this in a long time, it seems like.
No, I mean, I have been the whole time that was happening and coming out, and developments were coming out. I was teaching an ethics course, journalism ethics course at Columbia University, and we would. It was like it became this like ripped from the headlines class, because it was, one week we seemed to be talking about the coverage of the Jeffrey Epstein files, or what was coming out in the early releases of those emails. The next week we were talking about Olivia Nuzzi and her former fiance Ryan Lizza, who was writing on Substack all the time. I mean, it was pretty wild. And I would say to my students who are graduate students in journalism, one of my mantras throughout the course was like, there's in journalism ethics, there can be a lot of gray areas. Not everything is cut and dry. But I was when the Olivia Nuzzi thing came along, I was like, no, this actually is something you should never ever do. I can tell you that this one is black and white. Don't do that.
You could have just put her picture up on the wall and say, okay, that's it. Just follow this story. Don't do this stuff.
Don't do this. Don't do this. So, but I mean, it's been a soap opera for sure. And it's also something that, regrettably, I think if you already hate the press and you don't bring a ton of nuance to it, you're like, see what they do. And that's
that's an important point, because actually I recently rewatched the film Broken Glass about Stephen Glass, and it was really notable to me when I was looking at the production credits as they flash on the screen, how many huge movie stars had financed this film. Because I think that a lot of the public, thanks to Trump and Nixon and all these other people, have they really do want the public to think that all journalists are unethical, all journalists are liars, all journalists are trying to manipulate you. And so, the Newsy story and Glass, this is exactly what these people have wanted, and it really propels their narrative so far.
Yeah, and I mean the thing is that journalists do mess up, and news organizations do mess up, and then when they kind of come clean, or are forced to come clean and talk about it, when they, for example, have a public editor, or when they have to give back a Pulitzer Prize or any of that stuff, it actually seems to, even though, the transparency and the fessing up is necessary and the corrections are necessary, they actually also add to the problem of people's mistrust, which is at a low, very trust is at a very low level anyway. So it all kind of makes it worse. And it's difficult to know how the press recovers from that because it's been going on, as we've been talking about it, it's been going on for decades. And I think Trump has really, because he's been so constant about it, about fake news, charging mainstream reporters with being fake news, and talking about what a terrible reporter this person is, or you're a loser, and all that sort of thing. And even though a lot of people don't like that and they think he's being rude, I think his message still resonates with some.
It does. Yeah, and you, as a former public editor, have some credibility to talk about that topic in particular. And but those positions have basically mostly been eliminated. Although ironically, now CBS News has one, and he's a Republican donor and activist.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean that's not exactly. I don't think that's a true ombudsman or public editor. I mean, usually, if you want to do it right, and I think I was the public editor of the Times, and I think I think it was a good position to have. What you want there is a veteran editor or reporter, someone who is a journalist who kind of knows how this stuff works and is not, uh, as you said, and not an activist, not clearly political, and not chosen to have a particular point of view. I mean, when I did the job, I was trying to just reflect what the readers of the New York Times were saying to me. I wasn't kind of trying to bring my own politics um, into it, but rather to say, hey, I'm hearing from a lot of readers and they're upset about this story. So how about it, Dean Baquet? What went on here, and what is the reason this story was reported this way? And then, I would kind of be able to report it back out to the readers and to synthesize it and draw some conclusions myself. But it wasn't like it. I think the CBS one is it. That's not an ombudsman
no,
in the traditional
yeah,
sense.
no, I don't think so. Well, but these dynamics of organizations that issue corrections and fess up to mistakes and ethical breaches. The paradox, as you noted, is that when you tell the truth about your mistakes and your fallibility, it makes captious critics more likely to say, "See, they're all this way," and they themselves do not ever admit mistakes. They do not admit lies. They do not admit ethical breaches, and
Right.
and that's not something that their fan base ever, they never are able to draw that juxtaposition and that hypocrisy.
Right. Right. I mean, what I have said a lot is that that a bare minimum for judging whether a news organization is credible and a reasonably good source of news is, do they have a corrections policy, and can you find it somewhere, and do they follow it, and do they run corrections? If not, then whatever mistakes they make or whatever falsehoods they put out there or whatever they're doing, it's just on to the next thing. And so I think that's a litmus test. But in order to get that idea across to the public, we would have to have like mandatory news literacy taught in schools. And I don't see, I mean, I'd be afraid right now of what that would look like.
Yeah, if Trump's around the class. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
all of this does point to a larger dynamic, which I think a lot of journalists and editors and producers, they don't want to think about, which is that journalism is public philosophy, actually. If it's going to be any sort of approximation to reality.
and not just pure advocacy.
If you're doing reporting, what you are in the epistemology business, whether you realize it or not.
Yeah. I mean, we're trying to determine what's true. We're trying to seek and publish the truth, and the truth as close as we can get it. In when you're on deadline and there's a developing story, you at least want to stay close to the facts, and then try to get as close as possible to truthful information that you're sharing with the public. And it's not just, I mean, it isn't just that. It isn't just here's a bunch of facts, but it's also what stories do we choose to do? How are we framing these stories? What's the headline? What's the photograph? What investigations have we decided to put a year and a half into? So when people say, I don't know why these places can't just like tell me the facts and get out of the way. I understand why people say that, but I also know, because I've been in the business for a long time and have run a newsroom, that you're constantly making choices, and that's a part of it. And that one of the main purposes of journalism is to hold powerful people and institutions to account to the public, you know? So again, I think this stuff is kind of, is not really well understood. And, Matthew, when I was at the Washington Post as their media columnist for a while, and while I was there, it came to my attention that there were a number of people who, when they saw a source in a story that was given anonymity, so they weren't named, they actually thought that those sources were also anonymous to the reporter.
Oh, yes.
That it was maybe just like a phone call, like, hey, here's a hot scoop. And when in fact, places like the Post and the Times and many others, CNN, there's like a whole process for using an anonymous source, and the reporter and probably at least one editor, you know, absolutely knows who that person is. And it's a decision to, are you going to let them, speak anonymously? I think it's overused, but it's not just because somebody called you up and gave you some supposed information.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't know that people thought that. Yikes.
Yeah, I thought it was amazing, but and I would hear it from time to time. Not, there obviously are more sophisticated readers and listeners and viewers than that too, but some people think that. And we don't do a great job of explaining ourselves to people, and that's part of the trust problem.
It is. Yeah, and ultimately, I mean, really what the fundamental questions of journalism are: what is truth? How can we know truth? What in this instance is true? And what is meaningful? And these are all philosophical questions that have been being shuffled around by people for thousands of years.
Yes, I agree, but I also don't think that journalists tend to spend a lot of time thinking that way. Maybe they should, but I do think that most journalists are pretty interested. They want to get it right. They really do. And so that speaks to your idea about truthfulness or not. But then, you have politicians who lie. And what are you going to do about that when maybe one of the politicians who lies a lot is the president? What are you going to do about that? Are you not going to quote him? Are you not going to put his lie into a headline? What about if he wants to give an address to the public across the broadcast airwaves? You're going to take it live and just let it all spew out there? I mean, these are all decisions that have to be made, and there, there's no rule book really.
No, there isn't. Well, and that does circle to the question of objectivity, which is something that you recently wrote about under the headline, "Is objectivity still worth pursuing?" So first of all, what I mean is, and you quote the philosopher Thomas Nagel, who is very relevant in the context of machine learning and AI as well now. But in this context, you talk about the view from nowhere, whether that can even exist, and it can.
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
as you say.
Yeah. There's a change in the way we talk about objectivity. But if by objectivity you mean I enter a story, I'm a reporter. I enter reporting this story with an open mind, and I am looking for evidence that I'm going to then present to the public. If that's objectivity, I think that's great. But often, what ends up being called objectivity or seen as objectivity is just sort of like, well, we've got two opposing points of view, and we're going to present them as equal. um, and people call this, both sidesing things, which means like, uh, well, there's no such thing as climate change, and a group of people who say, no, actually, climate change is a big crisis. And like, if we were to present those in a story as kind of equal, um, that's and if we were to present them as equal, I don't think that should be called objectivity. It should be called laziness, um, because you're not actually trying to bring anything to it except sort of stenography. This person says this, and this person says that. So, if that idea is objectivity, then I think it's out of date.
Yeah.
Maybe it had a place once. But if objectivity is, the idea of entering a story with an open mind and looking for evidence-based facts that you can make into, what you're referring to as truth, well, that's a different matter. So it's sort of how you define it.
Yeah, it is. Well, and then there is also the question of who you is, and I think that's been probably one of the biggest ongoing problems of the national press in the United States is that it tends to overwhelmingly be the same editors who have worked there for decades, and they hire their alumni from the university they went to, or they hire their friends, or they solicit op-eds from their friends. Like there isn't, and so basically what it's done is it's created this insular community, which sometimes people call the village, quote unquote, if you remember that idiom. And like there's this, and it is insular, and it's not only not able to see certain stories, but also it excludes most of the public from the conversation.
Yeah, yeah. And then I think then there has been this effort to have what's been known as diverse voices. And, particularly in the wake of the George Floyd murder in 2020, there was sort of this reckoning in newsrooms about, wow, we see things from this old school point of view and we need to look at it differently. And that had its moment, but I think that moment has to some extent passed quite quickly.
Yeah, it has. And I mean, ultimately, I think what has to be done is that people have to figure out how to bring in new voices, but maybe not necessarily directly. In other words, you can say these are things that people are talking about, because a lot of times they might be somebody who's not used to being interviewed. They have no idea how to do it. So if you interview them, they're going to be embarrassed, or or they won't want to do it. So, but what they're saying is still important, and it still matters. And then also just the idea to, as you said earlier, that the media business has to educate the public about what this is, what you're doing, because ultimately, any concepts don't exist in some Platonic realm. Concepts are actions. They're what you're doing. They're not what you think. And even the act of thought is what you're doing.
Yeah. And I mean, not to get too wonky about this, but there are organizations out there that are trying to do that thing of teaching people how to compare and contrast, how to judge whether a news organization is legit or not. And, I'll just mention the name of one that I'm familiar with, the News Literacy Project. And it's like gone into like it's reached millions of people, but it hasn't reached even more millions of people. To sort of say, oh, and I'm sure you do this too. You see something circulating on social media, and you sort of go, really, I wonder about that. And then often, what I do at least is I start to kind of search around and see, is this the only place that's reporting this? And is this place that's reporting it credible? Does it have a history of credibility? Does it correct its errors? We could put the litmus test in there. Um, you know, but there's a sort of a learned way to not just go, oh, wow, that's really interesting. Let me share it. And therefore spreading it all over the world, which we've seen an awful lot of.
Yeah,
So yeah, I think we need some help in that realm.
we do. Yeah, and one thing on that end. So is that uh, uh, within political science and cognitive psychology, there's a pretty large volume of studies now over the decades that have noted that people who have more, let's say, intuitionist or somatic ways of thinking compared to abstract reasoning, that they drift toward right-leaning parties. So that the paradox of what of Bari Weiss at CBS and some of these other initiatives is something like that should exist, but it has to be educating conservatively inclined or somatically inclined people about abstract reasoning and why it's good. And I don't think that that's what she's going to want to do. But the conservative assent to democracy is one of the core ways that it can exist, because it's not for somebody who thinks that their own personal feelings about God or the Bible or whatever, that they are the absolute truth. If you think that, then you're not well suited to participate in a democratic republic.
No, that's true. It's true. I mean, people ask me all the time, you know, how can the reality-based press, people who basically deal in facts and, not just share a bunch of lies, how can the reality-based press get through to the crowd that is so willing to accept a conspiracy theory or declare that an election was rigged or so on? And I mean, I wish I knew the answer to that. I really don't. I don't think it's by putting Scott Jennings on the air. I don't think it's about the things that we've seen. And I wish I knew the answer to that. I really don't. But I think it's important because that, as you just said, if we're going to have a democracy, which is questionable, honestly, you need to have an informed electorate, and then what they need to be informed of is actual facts, edging right up to the truth. Hopefully, it's even the truth at some level. So, I think there's some real problems.
There are. Yeah. Well, and that's why people like you are out there, Margaret, to elevate
Yeah,
these issues. That you don't have to offer a solution, but we have to talk
yeah,
about
we
it a
can we
lot.
can at least
And
excavate the problems. So, yeah.
yeah. All right. Well, so for people who want to keep in touch with you, Margaret, why don't you give some advice to them?
I mean, I have a Substack called American Crisis, and it does not have a paywall. So, you know, I mean, I ask people for money, but you don't have to give me money. I took the paywall down. So that's one way. And I also write for the Guardian's American outlet called the Guardian US. And, those are the major places that I'm publishing these days. So, yeah, that's where to find me.
Okay. Cool. And yeah, great. And we'll have a link to your
Oh,
series
that'd be great.
on
Yeah,
the
the
list of
series, I'll
books
just
that
say
you
real quick,
published too.
was about sort of trying to take does traditional journalism ethics need a fresh look? And it was published in Columbia Journalism Review, so in several parts. So if people are interested in that, it'd be great if you gave them a link. I'd appreciate it.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, thanks
Sure.
for joining
Thanks.
me today.
Okay, Matthew.
All right. So that is the program for today. I appreciate you joining us for the conversation. And you can always get more if you go to flux.community, where we have the video, audio, and transcript of this show, and also a lot of other articles and podcasts about politics, technology, media, and religion, and how they all intersect and create our culture. And if you want to stay in touch, you can do so on Substack at flux.community, or you can subscribe on Patreon. Just go to patreon.com/discoverflux. Thanks a lot for your support. And if you're watching on YouTube, please do click like and subscribe. All right. I'll see you next time.